Last week, some of you participated in Sesshin, a silent meditation retreat. And at the beginning of Sesshin, our teacher, Shishin Roshi, asked us what we wanted to drop off and let go of during Sesshin. And many of you suggested actually that what you wanted to let go of was the madness of the news following the US election, but also, right, all sort of news that we have been hearing about for the past couple of months around the pandemic and around different events that don't left us indifferent. So tonight, I'm not gonna bring us back necessarily to that moment, right? What happened, happened. And I'm not gonna bring us to a deep analysis of the results or the current situation, but I will be talking a bit about some of the reflections that I think have entered the public consciousness. And one of the questions I think that many people have been asking since the results of the past US election have come up is, how will we live together in a country, in a time and place that holds deep ideological divides? These divides are not only about ideas, but they also permeate our everyday lives in terms of practices, gestures, decisions that are made. And this is, of course, not new. As we know, this has deep historical roots, but we know that the elections highlighted the coexistence of various perspectives, which in some cases can mean life or death for various populations. So as Zen practitioners, how do we connect with some of these keywords, difference, opposition, coexistence, and how do we connect with these questions that are asked right now in the public sphere, right, about the ways in which we live together with different perspectives, with different ways of seeing the world and living together. So every evening of practice at Great Mountain Zen Center, we chant the 4 great vows, right? In which we say in the first line, creations are numberless. I vow to receive them. And so how do we receive all creations, I think is part of the questions that are asked in the public sphere right now. How many times per day do we break that vow in our thoughts, through one look, through our voice intonation, and also how many times do we recommit to it over and over again? So one of the things that I think that is going on in these conversations is the question about how do we talk about our differences, and also why is it difficult to talk about these differences? And particularly when they might have us question some fixed notions about ourselves, which although we have been sitting for years, for decades, we do not really know what we're carrying around at times. So one of the spaces where I have often encountered these difficult conversations is in the classroom. So as many of you know, in my everyday life, I teach gender, women's, and sexuality studies in college. And in the classes, we talk about the dominant social and cultural systems of our time that create forms of oppression and privilege, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and etc. So most students have heard how these systems permeate formal and informal institutions. They have not always stopped to think about how their lives are deeply impacted by these and how they're implicated in these. And there might be forms of social and cultural conditioning that make it difficult to be with these difficult conversations. It might not have been the conversation that we had at the dinner table growing up, or that was the soundtrack in the background of the family movie, or that was not the conversation in the schoolyard growing up, perhaps. So in a book that I have been reading, and I have the book here, it's titled Integrating Mindfulness into Anti-Oppression Pedagogy by Beth Berilla. She's also a gender studies scholar. And she talks about the difficulties to talk about questions of privilege and oppression in the classroom. And she says, and here I'm going to quote her, when their when students' ideologies like the myth of meritocracy or their sense of who they are as a person are deeply unsettled, students will often fall back on various defense mechanisms to try to maintain order. Psychologist Kristin Neff, who is best known for her work on self-compassion, describes the way our bodies react to perceived threats to our well-being. Neff says that when we feel threatened, we close off as we feel the rush of adrenaline and cortisol and prepare for fight or flight responses. In ancient times, this biological reaction was designed to protect us from physical harm. Today, especially in the college classrooms, but we could say also in public conversations that are the context for this discussion, bodily harm is not as likely as the harm for one's self-concept. When our self-concept is threatened, stress hormones will often kick in, and our fight or flight response will serve to separate us from others. End of quote. So reading this in this context, I also wonder how our self-concept is questioned again and again, sitting on the cushion. But also going back to the quote in the classroom context, these discussions are often about dimensions of privilege and oppression. And if you're not familiar with the concept of privilege in a social sense, there's a sociologist who's named Peggy McIntosh. And she says that privilege refers to the unearned benefits granted to members of dominant groups and denied to members of marginalized groups. Here, when we talk about privilege, we're not necessarily talking about landmark cases that end up at the Supreme Court here or big work discrimination cases, but rather the ways in which the life of some people are simple, less stressful, more possible than the life of others. So we're talking about simple life activities such as going to the restroom at Target, for example, which might seem rather simple, but can be a real challenge for a person living with mobility issues or life-threatening for a transgender person. Going through customs on a trip, right, outside of the pandemic can be nerve-wracking for certain people, for example, undocumented people, but could seem like just going through customs at the airport for a majority of people. Being stopped at the traffic light might be very different depending on our gender and race, not to say life-altering or life-threatening event for some. So we're talking about quite mundane events here, which some have the privilege of engaging with without any fear and others don't. So who has access? One question also that we could ask about everyday life, who has access to these meditation spaces is also an important question. I have often heard in our group say that Boulder is 80% white, and that's true, but also Longmont, which is closer, is 70% white, and Loveland, which is about as far as Boulder, is 70% Latino. So I don't think we're outside of these conversation. I think that although now we are online, it's probably a different conversations. But when we think about this, how does it feel to think about these questions? What are the responses that come up in ourselves? How does our breath change? How does our body react? Which thoughts appear for us? So as we know, meditation practice provides some form of grounding, more space to welcome these bodily sensations of tension, emotions, thoughts, a place that might allow to engage in these difficult conversations. I was reading Love and Rage by Lama Rod Owen, a Lama of the Kagyu School of Tibetan Buddhism. And if you haven't heard of this book, it's pretty good. I'm in the middle of it. And there's a passage in which he discusses how he relates with anger when it arises, and how socially, as a Black gay man, he grew up feeling that living and expressing his anger could be dangerous for him. And in the book, he tries to reacquaint himself with anger as it emerges, allows space to notice it. And he says, and here I'm going to quote him, he says, "I think it was Suzuki Roshi who wrote in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, to give your sheep a lot of pasture." And I've been working with that for years. And that's the way I approach my anger when I'm having to interact with others in tough spaces. I give that anger a whole lot of room. I give it a lot of room and to be here. But I still need to do what I need to do in that situation. I can only do this because of having to make anger my primary project in my practice. I think here in a way, right, he's asking us, can I really drop in? Can I really make that room for these emotions, these sensations which are arising? Can I really hear what this person is saying? Can I really act from a grounded place that is anchored in that space, that is wide, and that we cultivate through our practice? I feel there's a lot of wisdom in that statement, and in a way pointing us towards a way of relating to these difficult conversations and relating to these emotions when they arise. Another way that I have heard to enter difficult conversation was prior to the pandemic. So I live in Denver, Colorado, and prior to the pandemic, I um, used to go sit in the mornings often at the Denver Zen Center and go to some events there. And one of the teachers there, Peggy Mehta at the Denver Zen Center, was talking about how, and that was prior to the pandemic, but there were already discussions that were tense with different views. She was talking about how her family was quite conservative during a Dharma talk, and how she had decided that it was important to still find a way to connect to them. And she loved them, she wanted them in their lives, but she also pointed out how she had decided in some ways not to go to some conversations that were difficult to have, and instead, in order to keep that connection, to focus on what made their relationships alive, right? And what permitted to keep that family together and stay connected. So what are the ways in which we stay connected with the people who are in our lives and who might have different perspectives, right? How do we engage in discussions with them in a way that can keep us together and connected? And here I'm paraphrasing Peggy Mehta, but that was sort of the spirit of her message here, of her teaching. So as we know, right, a lot of us felt the tension a couple of weeks ago with the election, and there was a palpable um, feeling in the air. And in fact, some of you might have read that in a survey, 70% of the population, adult population in the US was reporting to feeling stress. Um, and that was, in a way, perhaps nothing new as well with the pandemic that had been going on already for a couple of months, and feeling that tension and feeling, in a way, in the air that that yeah, that tension, I think, is the word here. And that brought me to think a little bit about a couple of years ago when I was teaching in the Boston area. Students of color often came to see me during office hours. In the US, if you look at numbers, 90% of full-time faculty are white in terms of their identities. And often what that produces is students of color will go see faculty who talk about issues around race and so on. And if they identify as well as faculty of color, often a large amount of students will come to office hours not to talk only about the materials, but also about some situations that they encounter in the classroom when they don't always feel welcome, where they might hear racist comments and so on. From classmates, or even where materials might seem steeped in particular views that could be labeled as racist. So I had many students who would come and see me, and at times it was easy to sit with the stories that I would hear and make space for these stories. But there were other days where it was not necessarily the case, where I was overwhelmed myself and going through a big day. And so I had a little bit this question, right? How to receive these stories, how to receive these students who were coming to see me. And I remember asking the question to Josh Bartok, who was the abbot of the Boston Zen Center at the time, and asking, how do we receive these stories? And his answer was, in the great ocean of shikantaza. And I remember these words going through me and hearing, in a way, make space. And at the time that that question was popping up in my life, also a few days later, Melissa Myozan Blacker, who was part of the same lineage, was visiting the Boston Zen Center. And I do remember her point on a topic. I don't remember the point on the topic of her talk, but I remember her talking about the Vilamakirti Sutra and saying the words that you might have heard, I am sick because you are sick. And the whole quote goes as, I am sick because the whole world is sick. If everyone's illness were healed, mine would be too. Why? Because bodhisattvas come into the world of birth and death for the sake of all beings. And part of being in this world of birth and death is getting sick. When everyone is liberated from illness, I will be too. So what do you hear in this passage? And some words might come up, right? And for me, as I was writing about this, I was hearing, I ache because you ache, because the world aches, because of systemic racism, misogyny, because of environmental degradation, and the genocide we all carry in our veins across the continent, because we want to love and belong and be part of Mother Earth and take care of one another, growing older and older with the planet, with the trees, with the scent of sandalwood and the smog of the city. Because we strive to be one and we're 1,000 and billions lost in disguise at the edge of our dreams of healing together. So in the past 5 months, actually, I have been teaching a half-an-hour class of loving meditation. It's a guided loving meditation class. And that was actually the first type of meditation that I encountered when I started my practice with what used to be called at the time the Friends of the Buddhist Orders. And and it has been really interesting actually to reconnect with that practice that never fully left my life, but that feels different in terms of the instruction in comparison with doing a koan practice, for example, in Zen. And so in this class, we go through the 5 traditional stages of loving kindness meditation. And we have actually a loving kindness prayer at the Great Mountain Zen Center that we say at different times of the day during retreats. that you probably have heard when we say, may all beings be happy, may all beings be well, may all beings be healthy and at ease, and for the sake of all beings, may we all be realized. So you probably have heard this prayer, and this is basically at the base of the words that are repeated with the 5 traditional stages of loving kindness, although I have heard slightly different wording, especially for the part of being healthy and at ease. But in these stages, in this practice, what we do, we basically send traditionally first love to ourselves, then to a friend, then to a person we do not know, or often called the neutral person, a difficult person, and then in the final stage to everyone. And I've been thinking a lot about the 4th person, right? And when we think about this idea of difficult conversations and how do we stay connected when we have different perspectives. And I've been thinking about it, right, with the current conversations in the public sphere. Also, for months, I didn't really have anybody that was really clear in the 4th position, that is the difficult person, but I had recently a fallout with a close friend. And so it has been really interesting to practice with that stage of sending positive emotions. And so for a while, I was just going through the practice, sending the positive emotions in part through the words, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be healthy and at ease. But in the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking and hearing different ways also of working with the difficult person. And one of these ways is thinking about the difficult person when they were younger or when they were a child, at a moment in which they had a different, at a different moment, right? When there is, we could say, this innocence, this openness towards the world. And I have heard from some people that they find that useful at times. And another thing that came to me this week actually was bringing to mind a moment when this person was kind to us, or when we were having a good time with them, or there was joy. And so I was thinking of this friend that I was mentioning that I had a fallout with, and kind of we were really laughing, and this moment where there is this type of connection, right? And so in a way, I think the practice here speaks of skillful means, right? Like, what are the skillful means we have to stay connected with different perspectives? And we could think about that in our own lives with friends, with family, with people, coworkers. But there's also, to go back to the beginning of the talk, how do we apply that at a national level to engage with the issues we all care about, like food justice, healthcare, infrastructure, education? How do we build a project together, even if you are you and I am me, and we might have different perspectives?